Well, good afternoon, everybody. I realize this is getting towards the end of the day, and we're the only act between you and dinner. So we'll try and entertain you as best we're able. What we're going to be talking about during the course of this conversation is how are we going to manage universal health care? How are we going to manage health care for all of the world? Not just how are we going to take care of people who live in wealthy countries in the West, but also how are we going to be able to help people in countries beyond the West? And in particular, are there ways in which we can tackle the problem of an aging population? I think this is something that's very relevant in Japan, but increasingly around the world now. We have this problem of people getting older, and yet, in many cases, they're forced to retire, and what is going to go on? Their health deteriorates, Alzheimer's disease becomes a problem. We have a lot of problems in this area. So we will be talking about that. And I'm going to ask Dr. Hacker to get us started, and he will give some overview. And then we have two representatives from pharmaceutical companies who are going to be talking about their perspective. And then finally, we'll be talking about innovation in making new drugs, in how we're going to overcome, say, multiple drug resistance and that sort of thing. And I will finish up by talking about GMOs and talking about the fact that for people who go to bed hungry at night, the medicine they need is food. So that's the topic. George, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you mentioned it already. We live in a world where threats to our health range from climate change and infectious diseases to the current situation of non-communicable diseases like diabetes or adiposity. Demographic changes and dramatically aging society all over the world add another dimension to the global health changes. This makes the need for effective global health systems and universal health coverage one of the most critical issues of the 21st century. The global burden and threat of communicable diseases constitutes a major public health challenge in the current century that undermines the social and economic development worldwide. Several recent health events, such as the Ebola outbreak, the Zika virus, and the recent cholera outbreak in Yemen, underscore the need for a global health system ready to address the diseases problems that might arise. On the other hand, not only the communicable but also non-communicable diseases have become a primary health concern for most countries around the world. Currently, more than 38 million people worldwide die from non-communicable diseases each year, accounting for approximately 2/3 of annual deaths globally. A number of non-communicable diseases share one or more common predisposing risk factor as cigarette smoking, hypertension, obesity, or poor nutrition. Global health is defined as, I would quote, those health issues that transcend national boundaries and governments and call for actions on the global forces that determine the health of people. So far, Ms. Kickbush, she's an advisor to the WHO. To face this issue, global health needs to move forward to an integrated, transparent and holistic action to achieve a better global solution. The process will be fueled by active collaboration of multiple stakeholders. I want to mention the World Health Organization, WHO, as the directing and coordinating authority on international health work, and the United Nations by releasing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. And I think these goals, many of them have impact and have also a relation to health and especially to global health. Effective health system require also well-educated activities. This in turn demands for excellent research and science, comprehensive teaching and education, and an infrastructure on the basis of state-of-the-art scientific institutions. There must also be new ways of cross-border teaching, of collaboration with low and middle-income countries, of translating finding and intersectoral intervention to protect and improve health. I will now end with say a few words what the Academy of Sciences can do in this situation. And I feel that the academies can play an important role in initiating and supporting global health programs at various levels and promoting a spirit of public discussion, for example, with respect to new technologies, ethic and strategic orientation. Since 2005, the National Science Academies have been advising the head of the state and governments in a lead-up to the annual G8 and now G7 summit. Before each summit, the academies identify urgent scientific issues related to the summit agenda that also carry wider implications and require a multilateral approach. In 2015, the G7 academies prepared statements on two health topics: resistance to antibiotics and neglected tropical disease. And the recommendations were incorporated into the Leaders' Summit Declaration. The summit was held in Germany, you may remember that. Last year, Germany took over the G20 presidency for 2017. The Leopoldina had been mandated by the German government to organize scientific advice to the G20 summit. It was the first time that science had its own voice in the G20 process, and the German presidency established a dedicated engagement group termed Science 20 or S20. The Science Academies country built this group. In their statements, the G20 Academies of Science call for, and I will quote these topics now, strengthening of health cares and public health systems. Second, applying existing and emerging knowledge. Third, addressing the broader social and environmental determinants of health. Fourth, reducing serious risk factors of disease through education and promotion of healthy lifestyles. 5, ensuring access to health resources globally. And 6, enhancing and extending robust structures for surveillance and information sharing. And last but not least, furthering research is a prerequisite for providing knowledge and new tools to meet these challenges. Based on the Science 20 statement, measures aimed to improve global health are featured prominently in the leaders' communique of the summit, and many passages of the text were informed by the G20 statement. This process indicates two other essential aspects when it comes to improve global health. It is a task of science to make their voice heard in the political arena, and it needs a political will to go beyond national borders to reach for the global goals of improved global health. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker is Vas Narasimhan from Novartis.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organizers of the Congress for the opportunity to speak. I am the head of development at Novartis, a large global healthcare company focused on improving and extending people's lives. Now, when I reflected on how will we be able to reach the goal of health for all, the more I look at examples in our work, I believe that organically forming networks of collaboration are going to be what we need to tackle what are increasingly complex problems. I'd like to give you 3 stories which I think illustrate the power of these networks to really bring innovation forward that can be transformative. The first comes from deep in the rainforests of Gabon. I was recently there to visit one of our malaria clinical trial sites. You see, in the Mekong River Delta, we have now the first evidence that we have resistance forming to artemisinin-based antimalarials. These were antimalarials that Novartis had the privilege of bringing forward in the late 90s, working with Chinese physicians who had long known that artemisinin had antimalarial properties. Now, what was incredible about going deep into the rainforest and visiting the Sermel Research Institute was the incredible capabilities that were in this center, the ability to run large-scale clinical trials in vaccines and for pharmaceuticals in an area with very little infrastructure. Yet through these networks, they are fully linked in to the epidemiological data for that region in Africa, as well as the latest genetics on resistant strains in the Mekong Delta. They can link into the 12 other centers with which we're doing this work. And you could see the power of this kind of network to build capabilities, even in places that are far away from our traditional healthcare systems. It really shows the power of networks to enable innovation even in the far reaches of the planet. And I believe in the case of malaria, it's going to be our only hope in order to be able to find the medicines we need to tackle this challenge. The second is a very different story. It's the story of our quest to cure cancer. Pediatric ALL is a rare type of cancer with which children who are refractory to the various steps of therapy usually die within 3 to 6 months. There was a young girl named Emily who actually helped the University of Pennsylvania and Novartis bring forward the first cell-based therapy to tackle this. She and her parents had come to the University of Pennsylvania knowing that she only had a few months to live and offering her up to be the first patient to be able to be treated by cell-based therapies. So then we partnered with the University of Pennsylvania, and we needed to do a global clinical trial to actually bring this very novel cell-based therapy to patients. We had to link into a global network of stem cell transplant centers, including in Japan, that enabled us to do research on these rare cancer types, including cancer types in adults. We had to partner with industrial partners who could actually get the various components of such a complex therapy to be fully viable. And we were able to conduct a global multinational clinical trial, the first of its kind, in which we were reprogramming the cells of the body to fight a cancer and reinfusing them into a patient. Now, I'm pleased to say that therapy was recently approved in the United States. We are working to bring it to the rest of the world and to Japan. But the only way this would have been possible is through, again, a network of collaborators, a really grassroots network that was very passionate about taking the courageous steps needed to be able to bring a cell-based therapy forward to patients. I can say in the case of Kymriah, the name of this medicine, Dr. Stephen Grupp, one of our principal investigators, has even started to use the word cure in the cases of some children that have had very long relapses to this medicine, with this medicine. The last example I wanted to share is in the case of Alzheimer's disease. And I think we all agree that Alzheimer's is another great challenge, and a great challenge as well, simply because we can't find tractable biology in order to be able to really intervene in Alzheimer's disease in an effective way. At Novartis, we're trying to run a prevention study on Alzheimer's where we use genomics to identify patients who have what's called the ApoE4 mutation, homozygous for the mutation, so they have a very increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. But the challenge is actually finding these patients all around the world to run a large multi-center study that's going to take 5 to 7 years to run. So we've had to build a network of partners who are actually doing genomics research around the world, who can build the infrastructure to actually do the informed consent, to actually get the genomic data, to sequence it, to improperly consent the patients, get the physicians to participate in the study. It's a massive undertaking requiring partnerships around the world, but again, we find a network of organizations passionate about Alzheimer's disease, including patient organizations. So I think in each of these examples, you see the power of these networks. These networks don't form through top-down direction. They form organically through groups of people who are passionate about improving health. They share a sense of purpose and pride about trying to improve the health of the world. And when I think about the work we do, we are trying to unravel billions of years of the evolution of life with every drug we identify. In order to do that, we're going to need the shared neural network of the world to actually be able to find the medicines and then ultimately get them to patients around the world. So with that, I thank you very much again for the opportunity, and I'll look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you. So our next speaker is Christoph Weber, President and CEO of Takeda Pharmaceutical Company here in Japan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the STS Forum. So first, I would say that in a way I share your optimism, Vas, that we can discover a lot of new treatment to many diseases. I think the level of knowledge and science and innovation is really outstanding. I see so many new technology, new science appearing every day. And I think the world has moved a long way into partnership, public-private partnership of all sorts. So there is much more collaboration right now, and this is very much the mindset of Takeda in the last 18 months. We did 50 partnerships with academia, with biotech, research groups. So we have a real concept of open innovation to deliver the next wave of innovation in many diseases. I also see a lot of consortium or groups forming to do research in areas which were neglected. So if you look at the CEPI, for example, consortium to do research against the next pandemic threat, that's, I think, a really good sign that the world now is able to be more agile and innovative to find new ways of conducting research. Now, on the other side, I would like to go back to the aging population phenomena, because of course it is creating a huge challenge. Many diseases are age-related, so the median age of cancer patient is 65 years old. So of course, the older you get, the higher the probability to have a cancer. And we are seeing this prevalence of disease not only in developed countries, but also in emerging countries. But I think the challenge of the aging population is not only a challenge for research, and it's not only a challenge to discover the new treatment against this disease, it's also the way our society is organized. How do we manage this challenge of aging population? If you look at many healthcare systems, they have been designed in the 60s with a reliance on young population, working population, which were a majority, to finance healthcare for the elderly population. And of course, when you have a reverse pyramid, and soon in Japan there will be more people older than 75 years old than young children, you have a reverse pyramid, and the healthcare system is not designed like that. The financing of healthcare is not designed like that. And I wish there would be more research in that, how to design an healthcare system in order to finance the next wave of innovation, to finance healthcare for an aging population. I think there is still a lot of question open there, and we need to be very careful, because if we don't answer that questions, it will create a huge pressure on the systems, and eventually it will have a negative impact on research and innovation. And I think this is something that is really important to tackle in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Hayashizaki, who is from Riken, and will talk about antibiotic resistance, among other things.
Okay. Mr. Chairman Richard, thank you very much for your introduction. So in my speech, I'd like to talk about the issue of rising cost to develop the drug. So today we have two speakers from a pharmaceutical company. So idea to choose this issue. So the conclusion of my speech is very clear. So that is innovation to make a new drug. So it's very important. But it is much more important, the innovation to reduce the cost to develop the new drug. This is a very key, I think. So after molecular targeting approach appeared, the cost to develop the drug has been exponentially increasing. It's amazing. It makes a huge impact to the delivery of healthcare, which is the title of this session. According to the data from Tufts University in 2016, the average cost in the last decade to develop the new drug was about 2.6 billion US dollars. It's huge, very expensive. So of course, the cost to develop this develop a drug is reflected by the price of a drug, of course. So because of the huge amount of the cost, drug company expects the fair return for the investment. Yeah, it is, of course, their private company. So, for example, the immune switching point inhibitor went to the market in the last year, recently. The price was around the $30,000 to treat for one single person, one patient, for 1 month. It's quite expensive. So here in Japan, so we have a universal healthcare system. So in such a such an expensive drug clearly makes the system be endangered. So on the other hand, however, so the drug companies cannot expect the profit to cover the development cost. I think the motivation for the innovation will be decreased a lot. It is something like a trade-off relation. The problem of the drug development cost is making another issue. So things became not so simple. On February in this year, in 2017, a report from a committee from British government was published. It says that infection of multiple drug resistance bacteria, so-called super-resistant bacteria, so in other words, antimicrobial microbial resistant, so AMR, would be the most common cause of death, overtaking the cancer in 2050. Okay, it is more than cancer all over the world. It's not only in US or Japan or Europe. So the number of deaths by the drug-resistant bacteria at this moment is 700,000. So it is predicted that it will be increasing to 10 million in the world. So for cancer, it is predicted to be 8 million around. So as a background of this, new antibiotics based on a new mechanism have not taken to the market since 1990. It is also amazing. So the biggest reason is the low profitability due to the following two reasons. The first one is antibiotics, viral drug, is administered for a few days, even for a few weeks. It's not so long, like an adult disease drug. So the other reason is that there is a guideline which says the new antiviral drugs should not be used as a first indication for bacterial infection. So to avoid the risk to create the drug-resistant bacteria. Of course, government have taken measures to facilitate the development of the new drug, new antibiotics. Maybe 2 or 3 ways. So, for example, rapid approval review. Yesterday, in the first plenary session, Prime Minister Abe mentioned that Japanese government changed the regulations, and we can put the drug into marketplace as fast as in any other country. I was very much happy to hear that. So, but especially as for antibiotics, rapid approval review is introduced now. Also, in the second way, so the extension of the patent period. In US, they are really making an effort to expand for 5 years more comparing with other drugs. So, of course, they don't forget to set the guideline for the proper use of the antibiotics. So, we have to avoid too much use of the antibiotics for example, virus infections or something like that. There are some countermeasures which can be done by us. So that is, very simple one is to prevent infection itself, infectious disease itself. We should pay attention to the not to be infected. And also, number two is we need to monitor the occurrence trends of resistant bacteria. So as an effort, as a public health. The third, number three, is to use the antibiotics in a proper way. It is very reasonable. And also to develop the POCD system, so the rapid diagnostic system, to diagnose the AMR. And finally, the new antibiotics based on a new antibiotic mechanism. That is very important. So that should be developed. See, especially for the last point, one of the most important countermeasure is innovation to reduce the cost to develop a new drug. So this is really important, not only for AMR, but also for all issues of delivery of healthcare. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to change the tone of the conversation a little bit here. I am always struck by the fact that so many people go to bed not having had enough to eat. The numbers that are thrown around, and we've heard several of them at this symposium, are as frequently as many as 800 million people who go to bed hungry every night. I find this quite appalling. I would not want to be one of those 800 million. But there are things that we can do about this. And I think one of the things we have to remember when we're talking about global health care is that the needs of the people in the developing world are often very different from those in the developed world. We can afford very expensive medicines here. In the developing world, they can't do that. Now, this whole problem of food is not just one of having enough to eat, it's also a question of having nutrition, proper nutrition. And if you look at what has happened as a result of an anti-GMO movement in Europe, the possibility of increasing and improving the food supply in many developing countries is being seriously harmed. It is just not right, in my view, for the Europeans or anybody in a developed country to be telling those people in a developing country that they can't make use of what is probably the best method that we've come across ever for improving the quality of plants. You know, agriculture was invented about 12,000 years ago. We've done an amazing job over the course of that time, but rather slowly. Typically, traditional plant breeding takes a lot of time, But now, with GMO methods, things are much faster, and we can do things really quickly. And this was all brought home to me because I went to a symposium in Ghent, Belgium, celebrating Mark van Montague's 80th birthday. Mark van Montague was the person who discovered the basic science that allows the GMO method to work, of how to get genes into plants that you can not get by traditional plant breeding. And I listened to a day of plant scientists talking about the difficulties they faced, first of all of trying to get funding to do science, and then of actually doing it. And this was all caused by the anti-GMO parties, the activists, and relatively small numbers, many of whom had been egged on by Greenpeace. Greenpeace really have been the bad guys here as far as I'm concerned, I'm afraid. And it was just incredible to hear scientists say that they were not allowed to do their work because of activists. They would talk at a meeting and the activists would come along and harass them. And I've experienced that myself since I've been talking about this issue, I might say, but nothing like as badly as the plant scientists. And what normally happens when science is denigrated, if you like, in civilian society by the general public, the scientists stand up and they defend themselves and they try to explain the science to the general public. That doesn't work. I think we as scientists often make this mistake that we think if we can just explain the science to people that they will understand it. But this has become an emotional issue, and again, because Greenpeace have found this probably to be the best fundraising mechanism they ever had. It's just amazing the amount of money that has come in, and of course as a result of it, they can afford to advertise how dangerous GMOs are. Mark Linus was calling them frankenfoods before he eventually saw the light and changed his position entirely. We have had anti-GMO people going out destroying field trials of crops. It's quite appalling. I've found it really too much to bear very often. And so after I'd gone to this symposium and got concerned about it, the following day I'd been invited to talk to the European Commission. And they had asked me to talk about the future of medicine, about which I have to admit I don't know a great deal. But after this talk I thought, well, I will make the case to the European Commission that if you're hungry, food is medicine. And this is something that we should be worried about. And so I gave a little talk to this effect. And I'd been warned ahead of time that this was really a taboo subject in Europe. You shouldn't be talking about GMOs. But I got a very good response. I had an Italian senator who came up to me afterwards and said she'd been totally against GMOs until she heard my talk, and now she was completely convinced the other way. A number of the staff members of some of the other senators who were in the meeting also came and said how refreshing it was to hear someone talking about this. And so I decided maybe now was the time to start a campaign. I talked to a few of my Nobel laureate friends, and they were very supportive. And to cut a long story short, I started to recruit Nobel laureates to this cause, and we ended up, by July of last year, we had more than 120 Nobel laureates who were all happy to sign a letter that was sent to Greenpeace and was sent to the UN, to the representatives of the various governments, which basically said and asked Greenpeace to stop spreading all of this misinformation about GMOs, because a lot of it was just simply wrong, and a lot of it was fabricated science. That got things started. We've had a number of things go on since then, but I think the only thing I can say at the moment is we're now up to 126 laureates who support this. We gather more from time to time as people hear more about this issue and what's going on. We have more than 13,000 other people who've signed on and joined the campaign. And at the moment, I'm trying very hard to get some of the civil leaders, people, religious leaders, people like the Rotary clubs who've expressed a lot of interest in doing some here. The other day I was speaking to the head Buddhist in China who thought that this was a great thing to get involved in. Because what is going on here is the science has shown very clearly that GMOs are safe. The method is safe. There is nothing inherently dangerous about the method. In fact, traditional breeding is probably more dangerous than GMOs. And we need to get this word out. And I think the important thing is that Greenpeace, in particular, and some of the other Green parties, should just admit that this was an issue where, when they first got started, maybe they were right. They said we need to do some experiments and find out if this method leads to dangerous products. But we're now 30 years on, and those experiments have been done. Enormous amounts of GMOs have been eaten by cattle and have been eaten by people, and there is not one case, not one scientifically valid case where there's been a problem. And so I think the time has come when Greenpeace should just simply admit this was something they got wrong and get on and do all the good stuff that they're capable of doing. And I don't understand why they don't do that. Because they claim to love science. They claim that science tells them what they should be doing when they're doing their environmental movements. And so what I'm hoping is that you in the audience will agree with me that this is a very important issue that is affecting the developing world in just major ways. There are countries now that won't take GMOs, and yet this is the only way that they're going to be able to improve their crops. In Uganda, banana wilt is killing the bananas. There is no non-GMO solution. But there's a perfect GMO solution that's already been carried out and is being tested in field trials. But the parliament in Uganda is still debating whether or not this is something they should do. Fortunately, President Museveni, the head of Uganda, has come out very recently saying this is terrific, this is something we should do, and urging the parliamentarians to go. I think if we can get one or two African countries behind this move, then we can really get some momentum and finally get things going here. And I would like to just end by saying that this forum that Mr. Omi started some 14 years ago was designed to bring the benefits of biotechnology to society. And I think this is something that if we follow through on what he would like us to do, we have the opportunity to make a big difference here. If we go out and talk to political leaders and talk to the civil leaders in society and convince people in the countries that we deal with that GMOs are safe, it is a technology that should be embraced, then we will be helping to realize Mr. Omi's vision. Thank you. So, now we can have a little discussion here. And there is something that came to mind when you were talking about malaria. You know, one of the things that we've discovered how to do is how to do gene editing and how to do gene drives. And it now looks as though it would not be beyond the realm of possibility to get rid of mosquitoes. And that takes care of malaria, it takes care of dengue, takes care of Zika, takes care of many diseases which affect the developing world. What do you all think about that?
Well, sure, I can start. I mean, certainly the potential of gene drive to limit mosquitoes is real, and I think some of the early experiments have been positive. I think there continues to be difficulties in at least some experiments, as I understand it, where mosquitoes are able to overcome the gene drive. And I also think the species specificity of using gene drive in different mosquito populations is something that needs to be worked out. But I think we'll need a number of different elements in our armamentarium. Ideally, if we can solve the puzzle of vaccines for parasitic diseases, which has been plaguing us for generations, that would be one clearly better medicines like the ones we're trying to develop, but it's obviously very difficult to develop medicines for many of these conditions. And then, like you say, ecological approaches like the gene drive. And we'll see how some of these early experiments go that Oxford and some of the other Gates Foundation and others are running.
Okay, George, would you like to comment?
No, I think this is a very interesting and promising technology. And I'm also quite positive regarding this. But we need more scientific information on this technique, the behavior of the fleas, the vectors. And if we will have this, then it could be an alternative to the traditional treatment strategies, I would say.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think I would make a parallelism with the GMO problems and that you developed, is that we need very soon a debate to happen about how the society will accept gene editing, not only with potentially parasitic, but with humans. And because there is a new field coming with the CRISPR technology to do human gene editing, and that will potentially be used to solve some disease. But there are a lot of not only scientific but other dimensions to be discussed, and I think the society should really go on debating how gene editing will be accepted. Otherwise, the same thing that happened with GMO could happen with humans and the gene editing technology.
Yes, I certainly agree. Do you want to make a comment?
So the controlling the malaria, okay, so that's a very fantastic technology. I'm really impressed. But at the same time, recently the geographic distribution of these kinds of disease is going to be changed. So in the last year, 2 years ago, in Tokyo, so we found the dengue. Okay, so it was not, it didn't exist in the past. But this is clearly that we also have to have some technology or some action to control the vectors. So otherwise it will spread unlimitedly. So it's my point. The second point is I dare to say so appreciate the chairman to raise up the issue of nutrition, GMO. So nutrition is best, I think, medicine, right? So this is, but at the same time, not only nutrition, but also water and the environment, including these warming earth circumstance. That should be considered as one package. This is my message.
You made an interesting point about mosquitoes, the fact that the gene drives are quite specific, very specific. I see this as a huge advantage because not all mosquito species transmit malaria. It's a relatively small number. And I can tell you from my point of view, if I sit at a table outside with my wife and the mosquitoes are around, they all come for me and they don't go anywhere near her. So I have a very personal connection here. I would love to see us get rid of mosquitoes. But you wanted to say something, yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Christoph's comment on especially in a forum like this with policymakers, scientists, and industry. I think having rational policy on gene editing has now become real. Because the technology I described, in effect, is using a lentivirus to insert a gene somewhere in the genome. Most of the debate that happened at the FDA public hearing was, would that gene get inserted someplace that would be harmful to a patient? And the other is, would the virus become replication competent? But the next set of discussions are going to be with CRISPR, we can edit out a gene, and then with some of the more advanced technologies, we can edit out the gene and then replace the gene. And given that now we have the manufacturing capabilities to do these kinds of autologous therapies, it's just a matter of time till this will come. And I think very clear on terminal diseases and extremely rare diseases where a patient has no choice. As we move to less and less rare conditions, I think the ethical questions now have to be really grappled with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we definitely need to have these ethical discussions. But let's make sure we include the people who are most affected by this disease. I think so far most of the ethical decisions or conferences I've heard about, there's sort of intellectuals in the West that have been trying to make ethical decisions. Zika was a good case. You know, if you thought you were going to perhaps get Zika as a result of living in an infected area and knowing what it would do to your children, the patients, or the potential patients, seemed quite reasonable and thought that getting rid of mosquitoes was not a bad idea. So I do think we need to make sure we have a very broad discussion here on a point like this. Now, maybe I can raise something else, which is something that politicians really don't like to talk about. We heard something about aging, and aging is clearly a major problem. But the quality of life at the end very often is not very good, especially with dementia setting in, with Alzheimer's setting in. What should we do about this? Is it time to have some real good discussion by the politicians as well as by the general public about how we are going to make decisions at the end of life? Would someone like to pick up on that? Or are you as scared of as the politicians are?
Well, I will agree that we need a debate, because it's not only how we manage the end of life, and there are more and more actually books and thinking there, but it's also back on the financing as well. So there is an ethical dimension, a religious dimension, I mean many dimensions, but there is also an economic one, and how much the society is prepared to invest on the in the late year of the life. And I think certainly there is a debate, but it's a difficult one, certainly.
I think it's important to include as many groups as possible, also the churches, and to discuss with them. And then this problem you mentioned, this is of course an international problem, and it should be also discussed on the international scene. So a place like SDS Forum is not a bad place to discuss this. Maybe this could be a future topic for next year.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea. Vas?
The way I think about it is we need, for real now, medicine to move from the immortality project to the quality of life project. When you look at the global burden of disease data that the University of Washington puts out, you see that well, it's two stories. Of course, in the developing world, we have a lot of work to do to still get life expectancy to where it should be. But in developed countries, you see the life expectancy curve now where most disability-adjusted life years are being lost are post the age of 80, and in some societies, even later than that. But then you look at the amount of time people live with significant disability, and it's actually increasing. Typically movement-related disorders, hearing, vision loss, cognitive and mood disorders. So there is a sort of over-indexing to try to get the last 6 months in our industry for certain, without enough attention to saying how can people live a higher quality of life, how can we intervene much earlier in chronic disease, which are difficult clinical trials to do, but ultimately probably where we need to go.
Japan is now really so elder ages and with small children, a small number of children. So the demographic population is now we have lots of aged people. So this is a very serious issue, problem. But so the point is, we have to think how we can so let them live in a very happy way. So it means so it should all of that care we should think all of the cares needs to involve how to give them not only social support, but also how they can contribute for the societies. So it's a much more social issue. And also, it is connected to the making a drug. So the drug is the administration of the drug is very difficult for them. So it means they cannot control how much drug can be taken. Okay, so it should the technology which can chase these kinds of amount of the administration of the drug and when they take it. So that kind of control needs to be served by the society, and also maybe drug company can give the certain technology to chase the drug administration to those kinds of people.
Right, but there is also the issue of individual choice. Should people be allowed to make end-of-life decisions while they're still at a decent age, can think reasonably, and should we put in place in society laws that allow them to make those decisions when they're still easily able to do so? And I think for me this is one of the major issues. You don't want to wait until your children are the people who have to make those decisions, because most children find it quite difficult to let go of their parents. I have a case like that. I have an end-of-life will myself, and my son said he would never give the instructions that I could be allowed to die. And so I said, but that's what I want, and he in fact signed off on it, and he said provided he didn't have to make the decision, that was okay. And so I think this is why we need to have this debate at a time before, and make decisions at a time before it becomes crucial. Anyway, one of the other things that came up that I found quite interesting was something that I think of as patient innovation. And very often patients come up with very innovative ways of dealing with disabilities, of dealing with disease, and so on. And there is an organization in Portugal that I'm associated with that actually has a website where they allow patients to share information. And this seems to me to tie in very much with these ideas of collaboration that you've been talking about. And I think very often we don't give patients enough credit, and we don't give them enough opportunity to participate in things like this. Would you like to comment on that?
I think you are totally right. At Takeda, for example, we really try to be much more patient. We call that internally patient-centric, meaning that we really are bringing the voice and the experience of the patient into the company, in R&D, but in all functions of the company. And that was, for many reasons, forgotten in the past. So the companies were very much focusing on the doctor's experience, and we still do. But you're right, I think the patient bring a lot of know-how, knowledge about, for example, the experience you mentioned about the difficulties to follow treatment. So I think that's something which is very valuable, and we are really increasing that. I think another technology change which is happening, and we didn't discuss so far here, is we'll have so much more patient data in the future, with digital, with genomic data, and there is still a big debate to happen how this data will be managed by the society in the future. But I think that will bring also the patient experience and voice very much more into research.
Yeah, George?
Yeah, the patient should be also involved in some decisions. I remember one case as I had to report to the German Parliament to a commission on gene techniques. And you know, in Germany, the people, most of them, they criticize this. But then we had a group of HIV-infected person, and they completely changed the view to the parliamentarians, because they were positive because of their hope to create a proper drug, a proper vaccine. And I think this is a good example for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, these online platforms, there are many of them now in the U.S., Patients Like Me and 23andMe, amongst others, that collect this information clearly are showing something that I think we've all known, but that there is the possibility to really create now personalized medicine with big data. We can actually identify high responder groups that will have significant efficacy gains through new medicines. And so that's important for the patients because they actually are the ones who will benefit, important to payers because they're only paying for real benefits, and important to manufacturers because we can actually identify in our development process who is going to benefit. So I think this data that we're going to gather through really understanding individual patient biology but also patient experience is going to be pretty transformative, I would agree.
So before you make a comment, I think we'll open this up to the floor. If anybody has any questions, maybe someone could come up to the microphone while you just make some final comments on this. Yeah. Please, no, go ahead. Say what you were going to say.
Okay.
Just while Ismail is walking up to the microphone. We don't want to have to make him run.
Thank you very much, Rich. I am Ismail Sirageddin from Egypt, and I really just finished working with Kofi Annan and Horst Kohler and other colleagues on a study for the African Development Bank. And I think the key point that Rich made earlier on about GMOs needs to be emphasized. According to the consensus forecasts of the United Nations, the African population is going to quadruple by the end of the century. According to IASA, it's going to treble. So whatever it is, it's a huge number. So the 1.1 billion population run now in 2015, you're going to have at least 2.2 billion, 2.5 billion by 2050. That's one generation from now. Plus, 95% of African agriculture is rain-fed, and all the forecasts are that it's going to become very erratic with less rainfall in the semi-arid regions as well. So you're going to have a disastrous situation unless we can develop plants that will have shorter growing seasons, that are more salt tolerant, more drought resistant. And we cannot do it at that speed without GMOs. So I think I just wanted to come in and add the numbers. Yeah. The numbers are 800 million hungry today. Who knows tomorrow? I mean, the way this forecast is going. So this is really a critical issue because on average it takes 10 to 15 years to develop a new plant variety and spread it around. And with the new techniques, we can probably cut that to 3 to 5 years. And that's an enormous difference with enormous numbers of people. So I just really wanted to bring that home.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think, you know, we have CRISPR at the moment, which is a very good way of making genetic mutations in plants. But it would not surprise me at all if in 2 or 3 years we have an even better way of doing these things. And research continues, and it should continue. But the anti-GMO people are busy trying to shut it down. And we need the research, and we need these plants. And maybe the most convincing case one might make to the European politicians is if they don't do something about this, and they think they have an immigration problem now, they're really going to have an immigration problem in 10, 20, 30 years. This is a major issue. Yeah.
Okay, GMO. That is, I think, only one solution to answer to the question to the current and the future starvation or even the treatment of the peoples. So I think this is very important, but maybe more than a medical activity. Nutrition is important. So at the same time, the adult disease, so is now not only for developed country. So developing country, they have lots of patients for this. And in combination with nutrition, so I had one very interesting case. So that is 10 years ago, or several years ago, so in Rwanda, so they had a really critical situation because they had a drought. And also, the crop of the price of the crop is increased. It was really bad. And at the same time, to help them, so the international unions, so they send the rice, okay, a lot. And so it's very good for them because it's easy to cook. And so also it is really easy to keep their food inside of their country. And but again, so the starvation, so it's a drought came. So, but they stopped to crop their staple food. So after that, so they started to crop the sorghum. And so in sorghum, okay, so they start to eat it, and until that time, diabetes frequency is increased. But they start the sorghum, okay, to cultivate and crop. The frequency of the diabetes is down a lot. So first, this is a very resistant to the drought and easy to crop, and also they are very much good for a diabetic phenotype. It induces the PPR gamma, or it's a totally it is supported by a scientific basis. In that sense, so to think the future, our strategy. So the food is and the GMO needs to be seriously considered. So we should spread our information that GMO is safe.
Yes, and I think one of the other things that is worth mentioning on the GMO front is that we can improve the nutrient value of crops also. And so, for instance, many of you may have heard of golden rice, which Greenpeace were adamantly opposed to. They did everything they could to stop it and then complained because it was taking too long for it to come to fruition. It has now come to fruition. Field trials have been completed in Bangladesh, and it looks as though this will be available within 2-3 years, which is really important. You know, there's something like 1 million children die every year because of blindness, because of vitamin A deficiency. And golden rice is a way that they may be able, to stop a significant number of problems in that direction. Now, are there any more questions? Because if not, I will ask one final question of the panel and get some comments before I release you all for dinner. Anybody? No? Okay. So what I really wanted to talk about, or have you talk about a little bit, is that when the Human Genome Project was done, everybody focused on sequencing all the human genes. And they seem to forget about the fact that we are actually full of bacteria. For every human cell, there are 10 bacterial cells. And these bacteria have made us their home. And they defend their home, and they're actually rather good for us. The vast majority of the microbes that live with us are good for us. And it suggests that they have developed mechanisms for stopping pathogens from growing that perhaps we could learn something about. Would you like to comment on that? And Vas, do you want to start on that?
I mean, there's no question there's a lot of potential, especially with efforts now to fully characterize the human microbiome. I think from a therapeutic standpoint, we still have some ways to go. But there's an explosion, actually, in small companies now looking at can you use the microbiome either to modulate responses to cancer or other immune diseases, as well as for certain infectious diseases as well. So there's a lot of potential. I think still early days, I would say, from a therapeutic standpoint to really understand what's possible. We're involved with a few venture capital firms that solely focus on microbiome-based companies that are trying to create therapeutics from the microbiome. So I think probably in the next 10 years we'll see significant progress in this field.
Okay, George?
I think it's one of the most exciting fields in biology, to analyze the microbiome. We are just at the beginning of the process, and what we need now is also to link the sequencing results we have to functions. And I think then I'm sure that we will get some interesting new molecules in order to treat patients with different diseases. So one cannot, I think, one has to underline this.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we need more basic research, as usual. Christoph, do you want to comment?
Well, I agree. I mean, Takeda focused its research on oncology, CNS and GI, and in gastroenterology we have a lot of programs early stage with the microbiome, but we feel that it could be the earliest opportunity to bring some new therapy. So it's very exciting, but it's very complicated. But I think what we see now is that we are not afraid anymore by vast amount of data. That's a big change now compared to 10 years ago. The world knows how to manage vast amount of data, and it's probably a good time now to manage the complexity of a microbiome.
Okay. Yoshihiro?
Okay. Microbiome, certain population of the bacteria could be a medicine, clearly. I think maybe 10 years later or 5 years later, you start to sell it, I think. Okay, so it was very exciting and amazing to hear that the 1 to 1.5 kilogram of the bacteria are living in our intestine and the colon. So it is really, really big. So at the same time, so if we use the antibacterial drug, it's antibiotics, okay? So without having any the deep consideration, so sometimes antibacterial drug, the AMR, may live in our body. So it causes a big problem. So it is connected to also a problem of the antibiotics issue.
Right, and yet another case for not overusing antibiotics. Well, I think I'll just do a quick wrap up here. I think we've had rather an interesting discussion on a number of issues. It's clear that there are solutions that are going to emerge that will really help us to improve healthcare around the world. And some of those are actually quite imaginative, and many of them don't just involve making new drugs in pharmaceutical companies. Many of them involve other ways of going about things. And I think we heard very clearly, particularly with the microbiome, but also with other things, we need more basic research. And at the same time, we also have ethical issues which we need to discuss, and we should make sure that those discussions do take place and that they involve all the stakeholders and not just limited to a few intellectuals who think they can make decisions for all of us. So I would like to thank the panel for their participation. I'd like to thank you for hanging around so late, and I hope you all have a very nice drink and a good glass of wine and a good dinner. So thank you all very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for participation. Now it's time to move to the special buffet dinner. The shuttle bus is waiting for you at the main entrance for attendance to the special buffet dinner. So please move forward to main entrance immediately. Do not miss the bus. Thank you very much for your cooperation.